media has been besieged. And because of this, it seems like the voting day and polling day is just one way to just put a tick on the list of things that are required to say that you have actually held an election. And really, at the end of the day, when you critically analyze this process, they are not really a genuine reflection of the will of the people, because they have been rigged to such an extent that what we are just seeing is the realization of what these electoral autocracies want. But still, as Africa and as stakeholders, we are still struggling to achieve this democratic dream. And increasingly, we are looking at digital solutions to see whether this is possible. And this is one of the aspects that will feature in the presentations that we are going to have this afternoon. And I'm very privileged to announce and give the profiles of the presenters who will be there this afternoon. Our first presenter is Dr. Peter Davis Mutesasira, who will be presenting on the efficacy of ICT solutions in times of pandemics within the context of African elections. Some observations on Uganda's upcoming 2021 scientific general election. Dr. Peter Davis Mutesasira currently serves as the Dean of the Faculty of Law at Uganda Christian University. He has previously served as an Associate Dean and the Head of Public Law Department in the Faculty of Law at Uganda Christian University. Dr. Mutesasira holds a PhD in Environmental Law from the University of Amsterdam and an LLM in Public Law from the University of Cape Town. Dr. Mutesasira is also a lecturer of environmental law and policy and public international law. He also teaches on LLM, energy law and policy, and the LLM on oil and gas, with a focus on the aspects of environmental compliance at Uganda Christian University. His research interests include environmental law, human rights, international trade law, WTO law, labor law, and administrative law. During his career, Dr. Mutesasira has gained extensive experience as a trainer and consultant, especially in human rights and the rule of law, biotechnology, environmental compliance, and sustainable environmental management. Welcome. I will also give the profile of the second presenter so that we can just save time. When they're presenting, they can all do it back to back. We have the second presenter, who will be Mugabi K. Ivan, who will be presenting on the question of whether media accessibility, availability, and affordability to politicians during COVID-19 a sign of repulsive or receptive tendencies to free and fair elections in Uganda. Mugabi works with King Caesar University in Bunga, Kampala, Uganda. He's a supervisor of research for master's students in oil and gas at Kampala Petroleum Institute, in addition to presently undertaking his postgraduate bar course at the Law Development Center that he sees will enhance his knowledge and career credentials in terms of contributing to Uganda's jurisprudence of legal practice. Currently, he holds qualifications including an LLB from Uganda Christian University, an LLM for International Commercial Law University of Glamorgan in Wales, UK, an LLM in Human Rights Law from Cardiff University, and a Master's of Philosophy from Cardiff University, Wales. Before I yield the floor to Peter Davis Mutesasira, I just remind all presenters, please ensure your microphones are off during the course of these presentations, and your video is off too, just to ensure that we don't have network challenges. Over to you, Dr. Peter. Dr. Peter Mutesasira.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Oh, okay. Okay. So my presentation is titled The Efficacy of ICT Solutions in Times of Pandemics within the context of Uganda's elections. And I'm specifically focusing on our upcoming 2021 scientific general election. And as of yesterday, and was it yesterday or the day before, the Electoral Commission announced that our election presidential is due on the 14th of January next year. And this whole week, I think on the 2nd and the 3rd, we had nomination of presidential candidates. And so basically in this era of COVID-19, Uganda has also not been spared. And just like other countries, we've also adopted COVID-19 response measures such as lockdown, curfews, quarantines, and the like. And they've affected all aspects of life, including the right to participate in electoral processes. And at first we thought the country wasn't going to have or hold elections, say that it's only a mad person who would think Uganda can hold elections amidst COVID-19. But to our surprise, there was a U-turn and the government was bent on holding elections at any cost, to the surprise of many Ugandans, and were wondering with the current COVID-19 response measures, how are we going to have an election that is free and fair? So in June this year, the Electoral Commission announced that we would be having an election, but it would be scientific in nature. Scientific meaning there would be limited face-to-face interaction between the voters and the candidates, or voters and those who want to be voted for. And the Electoral Commission, or the Independent Electoral Commission, under these guidelines, intimated that
Dr. Peter?
candidates and voters would only interact via the media and the internet. Use of things like social media, the radios and televisions.
Dr. Peter, I need to interrupt you a bit.
And the Electoral Commission, or the Electoral Commission, asserted that this is ensuring that the Ugandans.
Can you hear me, Dr.
Hello?
Peter? Yes, your internet is a bit unstable. Like you keep breaking.
Yes, please.
I would suggest that you switch off your video and just share your screen.
Hello.
Hello. There's a
Hello?
bit of a challenge with your internet. Dr. Peter? We lost him.
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you loud and clear.
All right. I thought your voice was dragging a bit. There seemed to have been a challenge with connection on your end, but now I can hear you well. And I'd suggested that you switch off your video so that we just have your audio for it to be clearer.
I have switched off the video.
Okay, now it is better. You can continue, please.
Okay. So I was at the point where I was saying that the Electoral Commission in June this year announced that we're having a scientific elections, limiting interactions between voters and candidates to the media and the internet. That is basically radio, television, and social media. And the Electoral Commission has banned public rallies, any mass gatherings, any sort of processions. And as of a few days ago, the Electoral Commission announced that no campaigns will be allowed, but candidates will only be allowed meetings, which should be held indoors or in secluded open spaces, and limited to numbers of 70. So one then wonders whether all this will ensure a free and fair election amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. And one would also ask whether this is the most viable option given the circumstances. But on the continent, Uganda is the only country, I think, attempting to pull off what we'd call a scientific election based on the media and the internet. Recently, Tanzania, Burundi, and all other countries on the continent, they've gone the conventional way. And the argument now is whether there was a rise in infections or whether the citizens were protected from the COVID-19 pandemic amidst the election. So one of the concerns of the Ugandan government is that citizens should have a right to exercise their right to vote, but they should also not be exposed to the pandemic. But the other school of thought is saying that there is no way you're going to contain the pandemic and also hold a credible election. But nonetheless, the government is bent on holding the election. And some scholars have also interpreted the so-called scientific election as not being meant to curtail the spread of COVID-19, but they think it's rather another mechanism through which the government is clamping down on the opposition. Because, for example, the incumbent president has high facial and name recognition compared to other new and emerging candidates. So that is something that can be debated, whether the scientific election is aimed at protecting citizens from COVID-19 or further clamping on opposition and reducing their visibility. But nonetheless, there is a need for the Independent Electoral Commission to strike a balance between protecting the health of citizens. So this presentation is basically in 4 parts. The first one is introduction. The second one gives an overview of the domestic electoral landscape of Uganda. The third one makes an appraisal of the efficacy of Ict Solutions within this context of an election. And the fourth one is basically the conclusion and also proposes the way forward. A brief overview of our electoral legal landscape in Uganda. The 1995 Constitution under Article 59(1) entitles Ugandans to a right to vote. Article 61 establishes the Independent Electoral Commission appointed by the President and approved by Parliament. This has also been a point of contention, that people who are appointed by the President tend to tilt the playing ground in his favor. But as the law stands now, he appoints them, and of recent, he even dismissed some of them. So people are wondering, how can a candidate dismiss some of the referees or the employees of the Electoral Commission? But that is what is happening in Uganda. Article 61A and B provide for the functions of the Independent Electoral Commission. We also have the Presidential Elections Act, which is the national framework law on presidential elections. We also have the Parliamentary Elections Act of 2005, which is the national framework law on parliamentary elections in the country. And as a matter of fact, both parliamentary, local government, and presidential candidates are going to hold campaigns at the same time. We also have the Electoral Commission Act, which establishes the Independent Electoral Commission as a corporate body with functions mainly related to elections and voting. We also have the Local Governments Act, which provides the legal framework for elections for local councils. Because Uganda's local government structure is basically a decentralized one, whereby powers are devolved from the central government to the local government. So the Local Governments Act of 1997, which has been amended a number of times, lays the legal framework for local council elections. And in the opinion of the author, or in my opinion, I also think the Uganda Communications Act of 2013 is very vital in this election, since it's now more or less a media and internet-based election. So these regulations and legal framework as laid down by the Uganda Communications Act will be relevant. So moving to an appraisal of the efficacy of the Ict Solutions in the forthcoming 2021 scientific election. Basically, what I'm concerned with here is, can Ict Solutions, which will be relied on by voters and candidates, deliver a free and fair, credible election? This is what I'm concerned with in this presentation. And I'll try to look at some aspects of the elections vis-a-vis ICT solutions. For example, if you look at the electoral cycle, and here I focused more on nominations and campaigns because those are the two aspects of the electoral cycle that are majorly affected by introduction of ICT solutions. The Independent Electoral Commission basically stipulated that nomination forms will be uploaded on their website, which is basically www.ec.or.ug, where candidates or aspiring candidates would pick the forms from, fill them in, and we expected that the candidates were also going to submit these nomination forms electronically, and they would be processed electronically. But to our surprise, when these forms were downloaded, they were filled in manually and they were also presented on the nomination day by the candidates in person and processed in a manual fashion. So one would wonder, why say you are digitalizing or you're doing the nomination process electronically, but when a bigger percentage of the whole process has face-to-face interaction, which would likely lead to a spread of COVID. And as an option, the Electoral Commission also informed aspiring candidates that hard copies of the same forms they could download on the internet would also be presented at the districts or picked from the districts by the candidates. So in my opinion, the nomination process really did not pass the test of full utilization of ICT solutions. When it comes to campaigns, as part of the electoral cycle, campaigns are yet to kick off. I think they are kicking off on the 9th of this month. And we're all interested to see how the candidates and the voters are going to utilize ICT solutions in a scientific manner, that is radio, internet, and television. That we are yet to see because campaigns are yet to kick off. But as I mentioned earlier, because of a lot of pressure, the EC, the Independent Electoral Commission, gave in unlimited campaigns to meetings of candidates. How will the candidate know that the persons are now 70? Because the Electoral Commission said beyond 70, that would be an illegal meeting. And the police and security teams at the districts would be empowered to disperse such meetings. So what remains to be seen during campaigns will be how these campaigns will be conducted in a country where there is low media and internet access. Moving to the second aspect, which is the efficacy of ICT solutions when it comes to multi-party democracy. Multi-party democracy in Uganda was reintroduced in 2005 through a constitutional amendment after a referendum. And Parliament also enacted the Political Organizations Act in 2005 to regulate the activities of political organizations. And in Uganda, we have political parties such as the National Resistance Movement, which is the party in power. We have the Forum for Democratic Change, which has been the majority opposition party till recently when some of its members left to go join other parties. We have the Democratic Party, which is the oldest party in the country. We have the Uganda People's Congress. We have JEMA, which is Justice Forum. We have some new parties registered recently, such as the Alliance for National Transformation and the National Unity Platform. Under the 1995 Constitution and the introduction of multi-party democracy in 2005, we've had a number of elections in 2006, 2011, 2016, and now this one, which is upcoming, all being held under multi-party dispensation. And all those elections prior to 2021 have been won by the National Resistance Movement. So we expected that political parties will also fully utilize scientific modes of conducting internal party democratic processes prior to campaigns and elections, such as selection of party flag bearers, the holding of delegates conferences to choose office bearers of different political positions in the parties. But to our surprise, very few parties, I think it was only one, the National Resistance Movement, which is the political party, the ruling political party. It held its national delegates conference virtually, whereby the members converged at the different districts and then teleconferenced to select a party flag bearer for president. The other political parties, none of them were able to pull this off successfully. But surprisingly, even with the NRM, when the delegates converged in the different districts, they were crowded in rooms or in tents. There was no social distancing. They didn't have masks. So one would wonder, is it because it's the ruling party that the police and the ministry don't do much to enforce the standard operating procedures to avoid COVID? Whereas the opposition is being clamped on to enforce the COVID response measures, for the ruling party, things tend to be a bit different. So in my opinion, the political parties have also not fully utilized ICT solutions, and they've encountered several challenges, mainly related to lack of logistics and finances. Limited access to ICT solutions may potentially negatively impact on their ability to effectively participate in the 2021 scientific electoral process. Moving to accessibility of ICT solutions, both to the voters and the candidates. Here I'm referring to internet, radio, television, and even prior to this scientific election, the internet, radio, and television played a very vital role, especially in facilitating access to information, which is much needed by the citizens during electoral processes. So Uganda has adopted the national broadband policy to enable, among others, access to internet across the country. There is still a large population of the country which does not have access to the internet. According to a National Information and Technology Authority survey of 2017-2018, only 12.1% of Ugandans have access to the internet. Only 15.8% that owned mobile phones, a smartphone. So with these statistics, as they currently stand, one wonders, how efficiently will the citizens engage with their respective candidates or be able to select a candidate with such low internet coverage?
Dr. Peter, we seem to have lost you there suddenly. Okay, I think he has been kicked out of the meeting. Let's just give him some 10 seconds or 15 seconds to rejoin. If he's not able, I think we can move on to Ivan Mugabe until Dr. Peter is able to rejoin and he can continue with his presentations. Ivan, are you on track to take over?
Hello?
Yes, I'm willing to proceed if Dr. Peter Mutesasira is. I think he's back.
Sorry?
Hello?
Yes, I can see you're back now.
It looks like my network is a bit unstable. I don't know what the problem is, but let me try to speed up and I complete before I get interrupted by the network.
All right.
So I was saying, regarding accessibility, I was done with the percentage of Ugandans that have access to television, which is only 41.3%. So if people are not able to see the candidates, then probably they would have a challenge voting for such candidates. Article 67(2) of the Constitution requires that no candidate shall be denied reasonable access to the use of state-owned media, but this usually isn't the case. Candidates are being turned away from state-owned media, as was illustrated by the case of Kizza Besigye versus UBC, which is the government broadcaster. Kizza Besigye was a presidential candidate in the 2011 election. He paid his money to the national broadcaster, but they denied him access to the television, and they also refused to refund his money. So in this case, the court held that this was a violation of the candidate's right, and they were, even the UBC was condemned to costs. And even as we speak now, opposition candidates are being chased away from accessing radio stations, even privately owned. So one wonders how we are going to carry out the scientific election in a free and fair manner. Regarding accessibility and cost, access to ICT solutions is still, the cost is still prohibitive. For example, a study conducted by Uganda Communications Commission in 2017-2018 indicated that a cost of 1 gigabyte of internet in Uganda costs 2.67 United States dollars, which is the equivalent of 9,819 Uganda shillings, which is basically the highest in the region. So in Uganda, our cost of internet is the highest in the region. So if the cost is prohibitive, then people have challenges utilizing ICT solutions for electoral purposes. The National Information and Technology Authority of Uganda, in their report of 2017-18, also reported that 88.9% of Ugandans did not own mobile phones, and they attributed this to affordability. Internet access in Uganda has been, the cost has been further complicated. The issue of cost has further been compounded by the introduction of what we call the OTT tax, or over-the-top tax, by the government of 0.05% per day, which translates to 200 Uganda shillings. So if you want to use the social media in Uganda, you want to access social media, on top of buying internet bundles, you have to pay an extra cost of about 200 shillings in Uganda, or 200 shillings worth in Uganda. So that means if I want to listen to my candidate's programs or watch him campaign on social media, I have to fork out 200 shillings per day. And I don't think very many Ugandans are willing to do that. There have been calls for the government to scrap OTT tax, but the government hasn't heeded to this call. But this is also greatly limiting access to the internet. It has also been reported that electricity is another barrier to accessing ICT solutions. Only 28% of Ugandans have access to electricity. And even with this 28%, they have to grapple with blackouts and load shedding. So electricity is another barrier. Even when it comes to mobile gadgets, you have to charge them, so you need access to electricity. So if barriers to effective access to ICT solutions is not eliminated, Ugandans will be denied a chance to effectively participate in electoral processes. And this will basically defeat the purpose for which these new electoral guidelines were put in place by the Electoral Commission. Moving to the aspect of gender equity and women participation vis-a-vis ICT solutions, vulnerable part of society, and there are so many initiatives by way of affirmative action to make sure women meaningfully participate in electoral processes as voters and as candidates. We have affirmative action whereby we've had a number of positions in parliament reserved for women, even in local councils. But when it comes to directly elected positions, their numbers are still low. And this scientific election and use of media is bound to further complicate or worsen the already pre-existing inequalities faced by women. For instance, women in Uganda have previously had limited exposure to mass media, affecting their ability to take part in a scientific election. For example, most women don't have money to buy space on radio stations, buy adverts on television, and usually those who do have such resources are funded by the ruling party, which has unlimited access to state funds, but still focusing on women. A report by the Uganda Bureau of Statistics in 2016 revealed that 6% of women access newspaper, radio, and television at least once a week, and only 21% do not have access to newspaper, radio, or even watch television at least once a week. Clearly, these are very low percentages. And if you translate them to participation in elections, you obviously know what the answer will be. A report by the Equal Opportunities Commission in 2019-2020 revealed that limited access, the trend of limited access of women to ICT solution was attributed to high acquisition and maintenance costs, poor network, and lack of electricity. National Information and Technology Authority of Uganda, in a survey of 2018-2019, revealed that 63% of females owned mobile phones, 39.2% generally watch television, and 9.5% of females use the internet and social media from various locations in the country. So if you have such percentages like 9.5% access by women to social media, you can only imagine what their participation will be. So generally, there is a concern that if these barriers that affect the women's participation in electoral processes is not handled in a manner that will ensure that they effectively participate as candidates and voters, in my opinion, their participation will really be limited. Lastly, the aspect of persons with disabilities. All over the world, there has been deliberate action by government geared towards ensuring that they are not disenfranchised as citizens of any country, and their participation in electoral processes is vital in any democratic society, requiring the elimination of any forms of marginalization of people with disabilities. Article 29A of the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities safeguards human rights of PWDs to participate in political and public life. The Constitution of Uganda in Articles 21, 32, 35, 78, all basically recognize the rights of persons with disabilities. Uganda has also enacted the Persons with Disabilities Act, the Equal Opportunities Act, Uganda Communications Act, Electoral Commission Act, Local Governments Act, all which guarantee the meaningful participation of people with disabilities in electoral processes. According to the Uganda National Household Survey 2016-2017, persons with disabilities constitute 12.4% of the entire population, which is about currently 41.7 million to 42 million. However, I was not able to come across any data on how many persons with disabilities are registered voters and will participate in the forthcoming election. So, a scientific process, electoral process has the potential to adversely affect the political and electoral processes. And in Uganda, in this context, they still face a number of limitations, such as inadequate information about electoral processes, mobility challenges, inaccessible electoral areas, communication challenges for the deaf, long queues that easily wear them out, lack of helpers or interpreters, because these ones also require funds to maintain them, emotional lapses and anxiety due to long waiting times in voting queues, low education levels, high nomination fees. For example, a presidential candidate in Uganda, you're required to pay 20 million Uganda shillings, which is about 6,000 US dollars. And a parliamentary candidate, you're required to pay 3 million shillings, which is about 1,000, no, it's about $800, I think, which is a lot of money within the Ugandan context. And most of these PWDs cannot afford this money. So this is already a knockoff at a certain point of nomination. A study by the Equal Opportunities Commission in 2017 revealed that the level of access to and utilization of mobile phones by PWDs was at 69%. However, the study also disclosed that 83% owned feature phones specially designed for PWDs and only 17% owned mobile phones. So this means that only 17% of the PWDs in Uganda will meaningfully participate in a scientific election, which is really a very low figure. According to the same report by the Equal Opportunities Commission, access to and deployment of radios and televisions by PWDs has been observed to be at 65%. That is for radio and 36% for television. For radio, the figure is average, it is fair. For television, it is really low at 36%. So matters are worsened in Uganda by the fact that most television stations do not even have sign language interpreters. So this basically leaves out those with hearing impairments. So from the above findings, it is evident that radios will be the most effective ICT solution for PWDs to access information and meaningfully participate in the electoral process. And no data or information was readily accessible to the author at the time of this presentation in regard to the utilization of the internet by PWDs, meaning how many PWDs actually access the internet. So in the opinion, or in my opinion, the challenges that come with accessing ICT solutions will impose limitations of the ability of PWDs to participate in the electoral process. While still, the new electoral guidelines do not detail any special arrangements specifically aimed at catering for people or persons with disabilities. In conclusion, the COVID-19 pandemic has presented the Independent Electoral Commission with a challenge which is unprecedented, namely organizing the forthcoming election to fulfill the constitutional democratic requirements without endangering the health of Ugandans. Human rights, such as the right to participate in electoral processes, should be protected even in times of pandemics. Therefore, the new electoral guidelines that provide for a scientific electoral process should facilitate an all-inclusive participation of all Ugandans, especially the vulnerable section of society such as women and PWDs. The government should also use the remaining months to 2021 general election, that is January 14th, to eliminate all the barriers to the full utilization of ICT solutions such as electricity gaps, high internet costs during the forthcoming elections. In a nutshell, in my opinion, as things stand now, or the current state of affairs regarding access of ICT solutions, especially to vulnerable sections of society, I doubt whether a scientific election or the use of ICT solutions will deliver a free and fair elections. And I can anticipate that there are really going to be a lot of challenges, and the grounds for such challenges will be the barriers that were faced in accessing these ICT solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peter. I really enjoyed your presentation and your paper too. Let me just stop sharing your, just waiting for you to stop sharing your screen. Yes, I really enjoyed your presentation, and what really stood out to me is the different tensions that have emerged from your presentation when it comes to, as Africa, we are speaking about looking to digital solutions, especially during COVID. But then we have questions around the global digital divide. Is it feasible in the African context? Are we able to manage an election that Uganda is calling a scientific election? Yet we have challenges when it comes to internet and media freedom. And two, we look at the global digital divide. And we can see from your presentation that should this go ahead, the people who seem to benefit most from such an arrangement are, one, the government itself, because they have more access to certain platforms that they can use during these elections. Those people living in urban areas will likely have a bigger advantage when it comes to scientific elections, as well as when you look at the gender divide, men will likely have an upper hand to this as compared to women. And then we also look additionally, you've looked broadly more to other groups that have been historically marginalized, such as persons with disabilities. And all these tensions have to be addressed before we can say that, Uganda is holding a scientific elections. I think I'll come back to you and actually ask you about public engagement and public participation when it came to the developments of the election guidelines, as you've called them. I believe you've called them the guidelines. Did they ask for the public input before they came up with these guidelines, or this was just something that the government just came up with? Because now this also goes into the whole issue of, we are asking for inclusive participation, but even when it comes to development of guidelines that will affect the people, their input is not included there. So I'll just let you stew up on that for a while I move on to Ivan, who will be the last presenter of the day before we open up the chat. We look at the questions in the chat box, which are already streaming in. Ivan, over to you.
Hello. Hello.
We can hear you, we can see you.
My presentation first of all, I would like the presenter, Mutesa. I happen to be the product at one time never been elected. So I'm going to be commencing by meditation relation whether accessibility and affordability.
Sorry, Ivan, I have a problem with your connection. It's not very clear.
Hello.
Hello?
Am I listening?
I don't know if you can proceed for a while and we see whether it has improved.
All right. Because so my presentation, I'm looking at media access.
Ivan?
And reflection is in relation to these aspects have created receptiveness or they have yet repulsed to the context of politics. And I'll be exploring this concept in primarily 5 or 7 slides. First and foremost, on the very first screen, I talk about the concept of media accessibility, because when about the moment we talk issues surrounding media accessibility, scientific elections have had one element. That's the element of.
And there's still a bit of static from your end, and there's an echo. I don't know if it's a problem with your microphone. I'm not quite sure whether it's an internet connection problem. I think it's a problem with your microphone. There's a lot of static as if it's moving against something.
I'll try to let me adjust something on the settings and I see whether it will make a difference.
All right. Let me know when you've sorted it out, then we can test again.
Hello?
Yes, Ivan?
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, it's much better now. Are you able to proceed? Ivan, are you there? Ivan, we can't hear you right now. I don't know whether you're speaking, but we can't hear you right now.
Sorry, are you able to hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
All right, sorry. I think I had muted the microphone incidentally, but I've just adjusted that. And I hope the voice is much clearer because previously I was using a laptop, but I've been forced to swap to that, to just use the laptop for the screen, and then I'll just use my phone for purposes of communication.
Okay, great. We can hear you. I don't know if switching to video will help.
I think I tapped a button incidentally, and then it ended up accessing the video. Sorry. So I may have to go back a little bit on the first screen. And so the topic I'm looking at today is media accessibility, availability, affordability to politicians during the COVID-19, a sign of repulsive or receptive tendencies to free and fair elections in Uganda. Now, of course, by and large, we are all aware that this year, all countries across the world, not just in Africa, they have grappled and struggled with the issues of COVID-19. But of course, for purposes of this particular seminar or conference, we are more really narrowing down or zooming to look at the aspect of elections and how these have actually impacted, and how COVID-19 has impacted, informed, influenced issues of elections by and large. Now, by the end of this particular discussion, I hope and I believe I will be able to clarify whether COVID-19 has increased repulsiveness or led to receptiveness tendencies in what we call free and fair elections in Uganda. Of course, I'm using Uganda as a case study, but I need to probably make a very useful caveat that the circumstances of the patterns or salient features of Uganda are not peculiar to Uganda itself. They may be fairly similar to what we are seeing in other countries across the continent. And so the features and the elements may be fairly the same. So first and foremost, I'll look at the concept of media accessibility. And basically when I look at media accessibility, now this year, when we had a presidential directive, there were preliminary suggestions or proposals to actually call out elections by way of scientific, what they called scientific elections. I probably put that in quotes if I'm writing a paper. Scientific elections, meaning I have personal misgivings and definitely reservations as to why we are calling them scientific elections. Now, one of the interesting features when we talked about scientific elections, or one of their key elements per se, is the reliance on media as a forum or a platform through which politicians could promulgate their views or air out their manifestos and opinions to the electorate. Now, that raises issues as to whether all politicians, that's the opposition and the leading party, have the same magnitude of accessibility to these particular media sources. So that brings me to what you are seeing there as the first slide when I'm talking at media accessibility. And I'm subdividing that chronologically into 5 different distinctions. Of course, first and foremost, I'm looking at the nature of political climate and the possibility of supporting media accessibility. I've already kind of hinted on one of the points which create a seemingly hostile environment, which may in one way constrain media accessibility to particular groups of people, but equally important, restrain equitable access to media accessibility. Now, I think in most of the countries, and I will probably use the word here, young democracies. Africa is one of the countries which, so probably one of the continents where I will see most countries are still young democracies. Because there are countries which have probably had their democracies historically from independence onwards. So we have what we call older democracies. Those are the countries in Europe which have had these elections probably as far back as 1800. So they have really had elections for quite a long time. So the political involvement between the leading party and on the other side, the opposition has always been relatively tense, and it tends to create a seemingly difficult atmosphere. So when we talk about scientific elections, one of the questions which kept on popping up and raising is whether actually the opposition will have the same magnitude of platform to accessing media stations. Basically, here we are looking at radio stations, which are actually meant to be the future of campaigns and political rallies. We talk about TV broadcasting stations, which were sort of already flagged to be the methods through which communication will be done. So here we clearly see a big challenge when we talk about media accessibility and the issue of equal access to media platform or forums. Then we have point number 2, Ugandan legal regime and its likelihood of enhancing media accessibility. Now we have a legal structure in our country which does not clearly clarify how and when media can be used as a platform for elections or probably for rallies. Now, the situation of looking at media as a forum for elections was created by COVID-19. It's not something which Uganda as a country had even envisaged before. It's not something which was previously anticipated. So, but when COVID-19 came, I think there was an increasing push to look at it as one of the forums through which politicians must be able to air out and communicate their opinions. Now, that created a challenge because we are embarking on something without a clear legal regime as to how it should happen. Now, of course, legal regimes are very important because they stipulate what can authorities do, what should the Electoral Commission do, how can it ensure that there is equal access to media platforms. So there is no legal regime whatsoever. So we are embarking on something without a legal framework to either regulate it or to even govern how it's going to be applied, when it's going to be applied, and who is meant to apply it. And then there is also another related issue along those lines is that we also have the technological infrastructure and its possibility of enhancing media accessibility. Now, I think the previous presenter, Dr. Peter, was clearly talking about issues of infrastructure. So when we already have technological issues, then the issue of media accessibility becomes an increasingly bothering concern. Now, today when we talk about media, sometimes we expand it a little bit further to include aspects such as social media platforms, which TV stations, radio stations are using, but also smartphones, which have apps, apparently, which give us some sort of access to different media channels. But then amidst that, we are faced with a seemingly worrying impediment of technological infrastructure and its possibility of enhancing. So in Uganda at the moment, not probably Uganda alone, but in Africa as a continent, we still have a challenge of actually reforming and actually improving our technological infrastructure so that it's possible for the different actors to be able to use it for different things. So in as much as we thought of a technological approach, which should be scientific-based elections, there wasn't a very streamlined model through which this could be effectively implemented. And so technology becomes one of the setbacks and definitely one of the impediments to this issue of media accessibility. But of course, point number 4, I'm looking at the public and private stakeholders and the likelihood and the likelihood of promoting media accessibility. Now, we have a challenge again when we talk about scientific elections vis-a-vis the issue of media accessibility. We are put in a position of struggling or grappling with instances where we have different stakeholders in the industry and they have varying interests. So there are media stations which are privately funded, either funded by particular individuals, either funded by particular religious groups, either funded by particular maybe tribal communities. Now that presents in its own sense presents a lot of challenges because those particular stakeholders who are either private or public stakeholders are likely to give media access to people who subscribe and apparently agree with their ideological philosophy. And so those people who probably don't agree with particular ideological philosophy may actually be sidelined or excluded from accessing media platforms. And so that is one of the underlying and probably subtle elements which come along when we are looking at challenges of media accessibility in this era of COVID-19. Then point number 5, I'm looking at impacts and implications of the pandemic and media accessibility. Of course, by and large, you cannot look at the challenges because one of the things which have come up with the pandemic are the increasing instances of lockdowns. And of course, these lockdowns, they have been imposed, and in some cases, there have been cases where politicians, they are not even themselves allowed to move from one location to another. They're not allowed to congregate with probably their electorate. So that has not only created tensions between the government and the political entities and different political rivals, but it has actually created some sort of ongoing clashes between the different actors who are interested in taking up different positions in politics. And so media accessibility stands out to be one of those certainly worrying issues which we cannot overlook or even underestimate. On slide number 3, I'm looking at media availability. Now, you may realize that in my paper, I maintain the same chronological structure across because I'm using media accessibility, media availability, media affordability as the key underpinning lenses through which I try to perceive and construe the concept of media and whether it's even legitimate, realistic, and practical in as far as enhancing these so-called issues of the scientific elections are concerned. So in terms of media availability, I'm looking at the nature of political climate and of course possibility of supporting media. Now in this particular regard, you may find that the moment accessibility is denied, then the media platforms become clearly unavailable to particular groups of people. So there is interestingly an overlapping interrelationship or interconnectedness between the first concept or the first aspect and the second variable. So the moment they constrain accessibility, then there will always be issues of availability. Now, at the moment we find that this is again also linked to the nature of political environment because you may find that by virtue of, if you had to carry out what we call an ethnographical research study, and to establish how many, for example, media stations or media broadcasting centers are located in particular areas, you may find that there are certain areas maybe in the country, especially rural and regional remote areas, where access to these media facilities are very few, or the location of media broadcasting services is fairly limited. And that creates a big challenge of the availability of these particular facilities within particular areas due to the variances in terms of access to what we call access to resources across the country. So there will be certain districts or certain political units in the country which don't have even a single broadcasting station. We probably don't have a radio station there. And yet we are saying in the scientific elections, we expect politicians to be using this as a platform. So accessibility, the issue of availability is intricately sort of interclosely related to the aspect of the possibility of us even being able to carry out the so-called scientific elections. Of course, again, that comes along with the issue of the challenges of the legal regime and availability. And I think by and large, you cannot overlook the importance of having a legal framework in stipulating how availability is going to be enhanced and actually protected, because availability is a key concept. But of course, the fact that the current legal framework and legal structure came in place without having clear benchmarks and clear safeguards as to how media availability is going to be enhanced, so that there is no legal regime to protect, enhance, promote, and actually protect and actually prevent abuse of media availability to particular political groups. Then we also have the issue of technological infrastructure. Now, still by and large, you find that there are certain places which have the access to media technological infrastructure is variably, probably I'll call them varied discrepancies. There are acute variances and discrepancies in terms of access to technological infrastructure. Basically what I mean here is that some parts of the country have fairly more access to technology than others. In other words, so there is a high likelihood that you go in certain parts of the country and most people still use what we call the old Nokia phones, and they don't have access maybe to smartphones. So this is probably underpinned by the concept of what we call maybe income, health, and education inequalities, which are evident across the national spectrum, the global spectrum of the country. And so that also impacts the issue of availability of particular facilities. So if someone doesn't have availability to a certain device, to a laptop, to a smartphone, because of maybe having no access to money to afford it, then that is in its own sense a technological limitation. And yet we are apparently quite aware that we live in context where most of the governments in developing countries are not only able but also unwilling to avail those gadgets free of charge. So you may find that people can't afford them or who cannot avail them to themselves, then they find that the limited availability of those devices leaves them out of the political arena if we are going to take the scientific-based model of carrying out elections or having contact with the electorate. Then there is also, again, the issue of the overlap of the public and private stakeholders in the context of availability of media platforms. Now, you find that by and large, the private and public stakeholders in the sector can only avail of particular support and equipment only in cases where they probably have vested interests in either particular media platforms or particular media centers or media media broadcasting services. So because of the vested interest, you may find that there is no incentive for public and private stakeholders to invest money to avail media facilities to certain groups of politicians, because maybe those politicians are not supportive or they are not in alignment with some of their ideological concepts. So we have the aspect of availability being one of the underpinnings within which the concept of limited availability to media can be resurfaced or manifested. Then we also have the impacts and implications. Of course, the pandemic is one of those underlying concepts which have actually negatively impacted media availability in the context that we find that media stations could have had access to particular resources, but because the economic dynamics and economic patterns have been by and large impacted by the COVID-19 period, so we are seeing media really struggling. In Uganda, apparently not very long ago, we have had cases where the media houses were really promised to be paid a certain amount of money for the coverage they are making during this COVID-19 period. But then it turned out that they were not able to receive that payment. So that shows the issue of the availability of media is by and large constrained by resources, because we need to be aware that media by its nature and by model of its function, it's a business like any other entity. So they have sales, they have their incurring expenses, they probably have to cover transportation costs to the places where they are going to undertake these coverages. But within that, it involves expenditure. So COVID-19 affecting resources. Certainly, media platforms, media houses have not been spared by the impact of COVID-19 and its consequences. We have the issue of affordability as another component, which I explore to look at the aspect of receptiveness and repulsiveness to the so-called scientific election idea. And of course, within this, like I have mentioned previously, that these factors are very interrelated, interconnected, and interlinked to each other. So you find that media availability, we have still, again, the factor of the political climate vis-a-vis the issue of media affordability. Now, you find that there will be political stations which may support maybe the opposition. But again, you find that the ability of these media houses to have relatively enough resources is fairly constrained. Affordability is more commercial. It's more of a commercial component of analyzing media, analyzing media factors or media influencing drivers. But then you find that if, for example, the access to maybe enough resources is vested in those particular media platforms or forums which are willing to subscribe to the agenda of the leading party, then you find that those particular radio stations or broadcasting stations which are in support of the opposition, they may not have as much resources as possible. And in other cases, you find that some of these particular media houses will expect politicians to give them some sort of remuneration or some sort of payment, you know, or they may charge them some fees for engaging on some of their programs. So not each and every politician will have that money, because you may find that, for example, an opposition political actor may not have as much resources as the resources the leading party may have. So they may not, if the media houses are going to charge them, if they're expecting something in return, you find that they may not, as some of the politicians may actually be constrained in terms of participation and involvement in political rallies on the basis of being unable to meet the cost implications which may come with these so-called scientific elections. Again, related to that is we don't have, because the legal regime should have been able to regulate issues of affordability, whereby if, for example, there is money put in a pool, it should have been able to clarify how much money will be, for example, given to media houses to actually support both the opposition and the leading party. And that should have been a fairly, the same figure, you know, the same uniform platform. If they say maybe there will be this amount of money to actually aim to make sure that all political actors or political participants, so incumbent contestants, are given an opportunity to participate in these elections. However, we don't have such kind of clarity. These are grayish areas which legal regimes could have clarified, and they would actually have been able to resolve the issue of media affordability, creating what I probably call discrepancies of variances in terms of how COVID-19 elections are likely to play out. Equally important is also affordability in the context of technology. So you find that still, if media houses don't have access to good resources, then it will clearly affect their capacity to have access to good technology. Now, you find by and large still, it goes back to the fact that if there isn't resources invested in media houses to cover the ongoing rallies, the ongoing campaigns, and yet they are going to be one of the platforms through which politicians are expected or mandated to communicate their manifestos, then we find that there may be issues of affordability. So there is still unclarity, because you may say in Uganda, we may have over 30 media houses. Radio stations are also several, more than 40. So the question might be which of these could be funded, and who is going to be determining or deciding which particular radio broadcasting station will be funded in as far as promoting and actually supporting scientific election. So we don't have clarity as to how this is going to be done. And then it creates sort of worries as to whether we shall have free and fair elections in the context of these scientific elections. We also have, of course, when we talk about affordability, resources are a key element, a very key component, which we cannot take lightly. Now, here we are more interested to look at, again, private and public sectors play a role to increase affordability or to decrease this affordability. So if the private or public actors are willing to put in some sort of contributions, that sort of clears the budget for media houses. It not only clears the budget, but actually reduces their production costs. But at the moment, we find that elections may actually make media houses a channel through which particular political entities may have their vested interests and other private stakeholders. And I had already mentioned before that you find that some of the media houses are inclined, or they are founded upon premises of maybe particular religious doctrines, particular maybe cultural doctrines or tribal doctrines. So you find that media houses by themselves, they are not neutral entities or impartial entities per se. They may have particular inclinations or sides which they may support for one reason or another. So stakeholders will also have ideological perspectives. So you may have maybe a private sector company, but it subscribes to stakeholders of a certain cultural community. You may have a public entity, but it feels it subscribes to a particular political ideology. And so they may actually channel their resources to fund budgets of media houses or media broadcasting stations which align or which are in coherency with some of their ideological perspectives. So that is a component which is clearly unaddressed as to how COVID-19 elections are going to regulate, are going to streamline issues of how stakeholders and private entities are contributing to the affordability of media resources and media platforms. Then we also have point number 5. There is again the impact, media affordability in terms of the impacts of the pandemic, because the pandemic has by and large constrained what we call regular cash flows. So you find that media houses, which probably would have been prepared and more organized to deal with effective coverage of political rallies, effective coverage of what we call registration of polling stations, effective coverage of the different activities, even clearance and approval of the different participants who are going to participate in the elections, they may not be able to do that. Why? Because of their funds have been somehow constrained and largely affected as a result of the pandemic. So that in its own sense presents a couple of challenges. Now that takes me to slide number 5, where I make some of the key observations. And one of these, of course, I noticed that it's notably apparent that the higher degree of political neutrality, the degree of political neutrality among law enforcement and political stakeholders, the higher the possible likelihood of having equitable and unfettered access to media stations by members of the leading parties as well as the opposition. Now, it's highly likely that the more political actors are never penalized or prohibited from advancing financial incentives to media houses, the higher the possibility of encouraging discourses of politically centered, which are politically centered, this posing funding strangers and another impediment to the media accessibility. In such a politically unregulated media funding environment, there is a real cause of misgivings and reservations on the possibility of having balanced accessibility, especially in rival political settings. Now, it's very evident that we are looking at democratic structures which are well demarcated between the leading party and the opposition. Now, the opposition involves all these other different parties. Of course, narrowing that to the context of Uganda, we have the National Resistance Movement, NRM, which is the leading party. We have the opposition, which comprises of NUP, we have the DP, we have FDC, and among others. Now, these are the opposition parties. But what I'm pointing out here is that in a scenario where issues of media accessibility, media availability, media affordability are not fully regulated by the different framework, like for example, there is no regulatory framework, there's no legal framework, then we are likely to find situations that there will be strong reservations as to whether these scientific elections can be effectively and successfully done in such an environment. Again, here I make some conclusion that countries like Uganda need to examine the role of contradictory and complementary political tendencies that tend to crop up in as far as aspects of media accessibility, media availability, and media affordability are concerned. Now, these concepts they have not been effectively and extensively researched. My analysis in this particular paper was not exhaustive, even though fairly comprehensive. And of course, and towards the end here, I clearly point out that these issues of media accessibility, media affordability, and availability, they tend to come up. They actually tend to create what I'm calling contradictory, but also complementary political narratives, which are worthy exploring and really worthy appreciating. Now, of course, theoretical concepts that inform and impact media accessibility, media affordability, media availability are understudied in spite of their importance in making explanatory and descriptive account of where lawyers, media journalists, and civil political activists overlap. Now, these are concepts which here I'm pointing the different, I probably call them key players in this sector or in this particular area, because we have, when you talk about issues of media accessibility, media affordability, affordability, and accessibility, they tend to hang along boundaries of different professions, along boundaries of what lawyers do. Around, when we talk about legal framework, is there a legal framework? And if it's not there, what could be the problem? Journalists, people who are actually involved in issues of covering media, the elections when they are taking place, what's their role? What can they cover? Police restricting them to go to particular areas, denying them access to particular areas. Then we also have political civil society, civil and political rights activists who are interested to see that there is fair elections, of course. And then there is also interconnectedness. That one I have already mentioned in media accessibility, media availability, and media affordability. Although this paper has explored these concepts as distinctive determinant variables, those respective aspects are interconnected in a way. That's something I've already alluded to in my previous discussion. Finally, of course, I end up by saying there is room for further research. Like I have already apparently highlighted, this paper is simply a precursor, probably tip of an iceberg, to what much more can still be explored within the different countries across the continent. There is still room for research on how to use theoretical narratives interface and of how theoretical narratives interface and interact with the promotion of the right-based approach in emerging democracies such as Uganda. This might not only call for social legal, but also comparatively designed research studies. Such a comparison shall expound how there are underlying variations in interplay forces shaping and sharpening the conceptualization of democracy, of civil political rights. Of course, more empirical studies are overdue on potential interactions subsisting in theoretical concepts such as the magnitude of receptiveness or repulsiveness and the extent of proactiveness or reactiveness and offensiveness or defensiveness as fundamental discourses. Now, these are things which I clearly mentioned that my research, probably there's things which a future paper can explore, but there are issues which have not been, especially the concept of proactiveness, reactiveness, offensiveness, and defensiveness. Those are discourses which I have not effectively explored since I mainly focused on the element of the narrative of repulsiveness and receptiveness. I think that's the end of my paper. Thank you very much for your attention. And any comments, any recommendations, any contributions will be highly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for your presentation. I think you could now stop sharing your screen. Let me see. Yes, thank you very much, Ivan, for that. And I also thank Dr. Peter for this. I know we are a bit over time, but also technology became an issue here, but I immensely enjoyed the presentations by the two presenters. And I think there was this similarity in your presentation when you brought up the issues of accessibility, availability, and affordability of the media, which will now be the determining factor of how politicians engage with voters and how this whole electoral process will play out in Uganda. But even as you've shown, as this is what is expected to happen, is it realistic? Is it feasible? Given the context that Uganda is in, that is reminiscent of many African countries, the fact that we are struggling with media freedom, we are struggling with issues of internet access, we are struggling with issues of electricity and infrastructure. Is this feasible in this context to say that Uganda can actually hold a scientific election? So that really came out, that really stood out to me. And I think as stakeholders, we now really need to push for access to internet as a right in Africa, because if countries are going to adopt measures that have implications on democracy that require digital technologies, then we have to ensure access to internet is universal and it's affordable and it's equitable. So just to ensure that we have inclusive participation of all people in this process. And so I pose that question to you, and I'm going to reach out to the chat because I saw at least some very good questions there. You have talked about these challenges and you have urged the need to eliminate these barriers, but I believe there's a very short period between now and when you're going to hold the elections? Is it realistic to say that these barriers will be eliminated before the electoral process? And now we know the implications of that will be that a significant majority of the population might actually not be able to actively participate and meaningfully participate in the electoral process in Uganda. So what do you say towards how to, at least, if not eliminate, but to mitigate some of the barriers that you have pointed out when it comes to accessibility, availability, and affordability of these features of a scientific election? And I will also just direct you to some comments and questions by Sylvester Kumbu on the chat, where the participant asks, has Africa reached a crossroads in terms of ideological concepts? In other words, is there like a conflict between our past and these concepts and practices that we adopt from the West? Are they feasible in this context, or do we need to actually move forward with looking for these African solutions to African problems? And if that is so, what does this look like? And a second question posed by Sylvester, she asks, and I think the participant is picking at a wound that has plagued Africa in terms of the weaknesses in the personality of African leaders that make Africa immature and continue to hold back high electoral development, or simply bad faith on the part of the incumbent leaders? Is it immaturity in the part of our leaders? Like, what is this problem that has held back Africa from going over that hurdle where we can actually say there's progress in our electoral development and generally democratic consolidation in Africa? I will pose these questions to both of you because we are a bit over time, just so that you can clear up. If we have any more questions or comments in the chat box, I'll get back to them. But we can use this as a way to engage with the participants and what has been raised. Over to you, Peter, and then Ivan.
Thank you, Marystella. There is a question you previously posed to me regarding whether there was any kind of stakeholder consultation or any form of public participation prior to releasing these guidelines. And I would like to tell you that there was nothing of the sort. It was only after the Electoral Commission released these guidelines and there was a lot of public outrage, then the Electoral Commission was compelled to summon mainly political parties and political actors. And I wouldn't say it was more of a consultation, but still the Electoral Commission was reaffirming its position in regard to these guidelines. So maybe what was able to change at that stakeholders meeting after the release of the guidelines was the Electoral Commission then conceded and then allowed for some public meetings, but also limited numbers to. Previously, the numbers were limited, but then after nomination of presidential candidates, the number rose to 70. So that was the only concession, but the rest remained as it was. Even when they went to Parliament to table these guidelines, people were expecting the MPs to reject. And one of the arguments was the laws needed to be amended to accommodate this kind of election. But because the ruling party has the majority of MPs, the guidelines were passed by Parliament as they were without any enactment, any amendments to the electoral laws to accommodate this scientific kind of election. So I don't know within the African context if this is the most effective way of conducting elections, and Uganda trying to do this as a first on the continent. I can predict the outcomes, but I'm sure, or I don't think any other country will be coming here for benchmarking after the outcome of our election, because the way things are going, even the Electoral Commission looks helpless. Opposition politicians are being chased out of radio stations. They are being denied visibility on television. And Uganda will also have a previous experience of where the government clamped down on the internet and there was an internet shutdown on election day. And given the way things are moving now, this I'm sure is most likely going to happen. And even in Uganda, over 70% of the radio and TV stations privately owned are owned by politicians and of the ruling party. So basically, this puts the opposition in a precarious situation. And obviously, regarding selfishness of our politicians, even these guidelines, they are masked as COVID guidelines, enhancing electoral processes, while protecting citizens from COVID-19. But anyone in Uganda knows the government is hiding behind the Electoral Commission to use these guidelines to clamp on opposition and basically curtail freedoms of expression and participation by the opposition in this electoral process. So clearly, even now, public rallies are banned, processions are banned, but the ruling party, their candidates are even being protected by police. But opposition, you converge at a place more than 5 or 3, you are picked up, you are arrested, you are brutalized. Recently, when we had presidential nominations, one of the candidates was brutalized by police and forcefully delivered to the nomination venue without shoes. And the Electoral Commission chairman didn't even ask, why are you dressed like this? He just went ahead to nominate and didn't even ask. Another candidate was arrested immediately after nomination, forcefully drove to his home and prevented from launching a manifesto. Clearly, the Electoral Commission was saying, well, I mean the police, you're gathering crowds and you're most likely to spread COVID-19. So clearly the rules are tilted in favor of, they have the power, they own most of the media, privately owned in the country. Even UBC, the national broadcaster, public broadcaster, is under the firm grip of the ruling party. So that is it from me, Marystella. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. You did bring up a very interesting point. We have seen, if you've been following the developments in Uganda, you can tell some of the issues we've seen about how the nominations are currently happening. And if it's a reflection of what is going to happen in 2021, it's already concerning, and stakeholders, we should pay more attention to that. Ivan, your response to this?
Thank you very much, Stella. I think it's very evident. Peter has just clarified what scenes we have lately witnessed. The manifestation of unfolding events in the political landscape are certainly troubling and evidently worrying. I think I think I will be frank that I think it will take a time for our political leaders to appreciate that you can be in power for a certain period of time and another political party takes over, and it's very normal, it's very lawful. Currently, what we are seeing, it looks like elections are simply for the sake, they happen for the sake of happening. And they are not seen as a mode of changing leadership from one entity to another. And I think that's quite a worrying picture. And it also reflects the question which has been raised that, well, we are adopting westernized, individualized electoral processes. I have a feeling that you find that because there are two, we have what we call electoral colleges in certain countries. There is also what we call universal adult suffrage. For presidential elections, it's basically universal adult suffrage. But the question has always been hanging or resolving around how should people line behind their particular candidates and then they make a line and you can count them, or should people actually vote online digitally? And I think the opposition is quite discomfort with these issues. And I think it's very clear why it would be discomfort, because they think, if rigging has been happening through ballot papers, then when we say it's scientific and it's digital voting, how inclusive will that be when people cannot even afford laptops? People can't afford mobile phones. So I think it has been really, really evident that some of these, the method of scientific elections, the opposition clearly has a reason to feel that it's being used as a scapegoat to actually, at the end of the day, turn out to use elections as a model of rigging without a chance of tracking evidence or tracing evidence for such rigging. And of course, the nomination events we have seen recently are horrific. They are horrendous. I mean, candidates appearing on platforms without shoes, then arresting of some of the nominated candidates, probably 10 minutes after being nominated. Such scenes, honestly, they are quite embarrassing. I mean, and when you are looking at it from an international dimension or perspective, some countries, because sometimes we may say, well, we are adopting westernized ideas, but we should sometimes put a boundary. There are things we cannot blame westernized ideology. We should blame them on our behavior. Surely, why should someone be arrested after they have been nominated? Why should police take off someone's shoes when he's going for nomination? I can't see how I can attribute responsibility, liability, or accountability to a Westerner for that. I think we need to our political entities, our political stakeholders need to change themselves. I think whoever has been in the West or has interacted with how Western society context deals with their democracy, you make a comparative analysis, and sometimes you lose words, you become silent, because the scenes you can witness sometimes in our elections here, they leave a lot to be desired. That's what I can say.
All right, thank you very much, Ivan. And I'm just about to give the presenters 1 minute to round off so that we can finally call this meeting to an end. But I'd like to draw, at least to speak out what Janelle Magwanda has said. She speaks about Africa having a youthful population, but our leaders are old. And do we expect them, given this old population, do we expect them to make use of these solutions? But I actually make reference to what Nanjala Nyabola said in her recent book. She said, while it started, these leaders did not know about the impact that the digital age was going to pose to us. They did not understand the power that people could be able to harness from social media platforms and digital technologies. But now they're learning, and they're learning fast, and they are beating us in the game because they have now known how to use these digital technologies to advance their authoritarian tendencies. And we need to be very keen to push back against the actions of electoral authoritarians, because they might have been they might have not been sure of the impact of these digital technologies, but now they do know. So I believe even if we have an aging leadership, they are not old when it comes to learning about electronics and digital technologies and how they can use them to their advantage. And maybe now in conclusion, I could give 1 minute to Ivan and Dr. Peter to just give their closing remarks before we end this conference. Dr. Peter.
Thank you, Marystella. Maybe before I forget, let me begin by thanking you for putting this together. This is the new normal for us to interact virtually. Probably if things were normal, the interactions would be different, but nonetheless, this is good, better than nothing. On the theme of this whole engagement, I think Africa's problems are all centered around elections, because you cannot say African leaders are the problem without looking at the processes through which they came to power. And in Uganda, people have always said the election is more of a selection, but what do you do? Even now, most of us know the outcome, but well, it's a ritual we have to go through. But you wonder why there has to be a lot of pulling back and forth, a lot of brutality, people are losing lives, we are suffering economically. And in my opinion, I don't think these scientific election or electoral guidelines providing for scientific election were brought in good faith. Off the record, some people are claiming our president is probably too fatigued to move around the country, so probably he has a high advantage in scientific elections. Some COVID-19 response measures are still in effect in Uganda, things like curfew. Obviously, it won't apply to the president. When he gathers numbers, the SOPs, social distancing, will not apply to him. But maybe we can make good out of a bad situation. Let all the barriers that limit effective access to electoral processes, especially by way of accessibility, the cost, special attention being paid to the vulnerable and disadvantaged groups like the women and the disabled. If at least something can be done about these limitations, then probably would get to a point where I would say not all is well, but at least the ground is a bit leveled and all participants as voters and candidates can participate in this electoral process in a free and fair manner. But as things stand now, the picture isn't really a good one. But nonetheless, we are hoping for the best. And even the Electoral Commission, their independence has really been put to the test. Recently, the president fired some officials and he bragged about it that I fired them, while the Electoral Commission chairman was saying that they resigned or took early retirement. So who was fooling who? But we're basically hoping for the best. And in these few months left, which are around 2 months, I don't know if much can be done about the accessibility concerns, but we're basically hoping for the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peter. Ivan, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Marystella. mine is just to move a vote of thanks to the organizing team, but also our participants, the different attendants, my fellow presenter, Dr. Peter, but also who happens to be a former lecturer to me. We are really grateful for the efforts you have put in, for the enormous work you do, behind curtains to make this a success. But of course, by and large, there is no doubt the rule of law before COVID-19, during COVID-19, we don't know whether we can say after, because that would be being too optimistic, but COVID-19 can be looked as a scene which has been a turning point to the rule of law and actually the narrative of rights. Because from 2020, is it March or February, ideas of right-based approaches have sort of been constrained and completely engulfed into the growing powers of the executive, the growing executive powers to implement lockdown, to implement curfews, perhaps not only in Africa, but across the globe. So ideas we have valued, treasured, grown, enjoying to read and actually educate people about, we are seeing them wiped off the surface just through the narrative of implementing COVID-19 rules. So we are yet to see, and even elections have, not been spared, election in the COVID-19 era. So the rule of law, we are still looking to think of ways how it should stand amidst this pandemic of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan and Dr. Peter. I'm even glad to hear not only Ivan, have you mentioned that Dr. Peter was your lecturer? Somebody else did mention so in the chat box. So it's really good to see that you have the support of your students here too.
Indeed, it's a small world.
It is a very small world. It's good when your students are able to acknowledge you in your work too. And to even share the same platform with your students is quite amazing. In conclusion, I just want to thank everyone, all the participants who have been with us since yesterday and even today. I presented as a special thanks to our presenters who at first even developed papers around this, which will publish in the African Human Rights Journal for the Center for Human Rights in the University of Pretoria. They'll be available, I'm sure, for publication should be next year, but their papers are finalized and they will be published. We thank you all for the discussions, the participation on the chat box has been phenomenal. I have really enjoyed engaging with everybody on the chat box, and we hope to continue these conversations around elections and democracy in Africa, because this is a crucial issue that affects Africa. And at some point, we have to ensure that this dream of African solutions for African problems is actually realized. If it's a problem of immature leaders, we need to know how to remove these leaders that we have placed in powers. If it's a problem of electoral authoritarianism, we have to ensure that our elections actually meet the standards of free, fair, and credible elections. And to do that, we really need the input of all stakeholders in this platform: private, public sector, media, regulators, social media companies. All stakeholders involved in this process are necessary to ensure that we achieve this ideal. Just as a reminder, the recordings of the session are available on the Center for Human Rights social media pages if you want to go back and look at them. Before I close off this meeting, I should ask my co-host, Bonolo, if you have anything to say in conclusion.
Thank you, Marystella. I just want to say to everyone again, a good thank you to our participants. Thank you so much to all the presenters. As Marystella noted, the papers for the presenters will be available hopefully sometime next year, May, April, around that time, considering all the peer review processes that are usually longer, but we're hoping that it will be out before then. What we can do in the meantime, because we've got everyone's details, the recording will be on the website, but what we can do in the meantime, we can share PowerPoint presentations from all our participants on your emails as you anticipate the publication of the presenters' papers. But again, from the Center for Human Rights, from the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit, and from the Expression Unit, we want to say thank you so very much. We appreciate your support. We appreciate giving out your time. And we've really had very robust and meaningful conversations just creating knowledge, developing knowledge, and together figuring out how we can fix Africa's problems as Africans. And for that, we are grateful. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, Bonolo, for that. And with that, I think I could just ask everybody to switch on the videos and we can wave goodbye and we can officially call this conference to a close. And say again, thank you very much for your participation. If we could switch on our videos for 2 seconds just to wave goodbye, that would be good. I can see a few videos are open, so we can say goodbye, everyone. And you can enjoy the rest of your week and enjoy your weekend and stay safe.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.